On the podcast today, we're going to speak about Jiddu Krishnamurti, David Bohm, and the oneness of reality or wholeness. So something that is connected to both gentlemen. And, we'll speak first of all about Jiddu, but when we talk about Jiddu, David was one of the individuals who got the most out of Jiddu, like his philosophy. He was able to, get in a really good discussion with Jiddu, and Jiddu was one of those guys you had to sort of be in a discussion with and mine the territory and, to bring out the gold that he had to share. It was very difficult sometimes for Jiddu just to speak about what he understood just off the cuff. That's why most of his, lectures and so forth and so on were like a question-answer sort of format and, like a satsang, right? Like a satsang. And it was like when Aldous Huxley first met Jiddu, he said it was like meeting the Buddha. You know what I mean? He said it was like meeting the Buddha. And he actually was instrumental in some sense in helping expand Jiddu's knowledge in the West. Aldous was at that time. And when we look at the history of Jiddu Krishnamurti, it's very interesting, right? So, we have to go back all the way back to the Theosophical Society. So even back to Madame Blavatsky, right? Like, even though she never knew Jiddu, but the Theosophy is what contributed to the idea of a world teacher. Now, I don't think, maybe, I'm not sure, but not sure if that was Madame Blavatsky's intention, but Annie Besant and Charles Ledbetter, who kind of took over Theosophy, and a lot of people didn't agree with them taking over the Theosophical Society, but they both had a vision of the world teacher, like this savior, this messiah, the Maitreya, and like there's the idea of the Maitreya in Buddhism and stuff like that. So they were kind of fixated on this idea, and then they found this boy in Madras, Chennai, and actually his father was working at the Theosophical Society, and so they nurtured him. Ledbetter believed that he was a bit of a clairvoyant himself and had all these insights, felt that this young boy could be someone or something special in the world. He was right in the end, right? But maybe not in the way that he
want him to be.
You know what I mean? Like, so. And for those who don't know a lot about Theosophy in a sense, I enjoy reading like The Secret Doctrine and so forth and so on, a lot of the texts in the Theosophical Society, but Theosophy itself did contribute to a lot of New Age thought. We can't beat around the bush here. Like, there was a lot of, warping of especially Hindu and Buddhist knowledge, because, the Theosophical Society began in India, and so there was a lot of warping of the knowledge. That's why you get a lot of New Age ideas and that. And one of those New Age ideas was this eventual world teacher, right? And so there was, like they nurtured Annie Besant and Charles Ledbetter, nurtured Jiddu for a long time. Actually, they adopted him. And so they nurtured him, and then they made there was a few orders, but the last order was the Order of the Star in the East. And there was always like excitement around like the group that they had, this order that maybe Jiddu's the world teacher and this and that. And then Jiddu actually, like, he as we know, like, he dissolved the order. Like, he said, I know you guys want a world teacher and this and that, but it's not me. My quest is to free men completely. Like, and that doesn't come about by following a person or, that was the famous "Truth is a Pathless Land." That famous sentence by him, and that famous speech was the dissolution of that order, which made a lot of people angry. Charles Ledbetter was actually very angry about it.
That he was upset about how Jiddu wanted to leave the
and he did leave.
Yes, in the end.
In the end, he did leave. Like, he said, "I'm not the world teacher." Like, he said, "I know you guys." He was pretty forthcoming, and if you read the transcript, he was saying, "I know you guys are interested in setting up your own new gods and your new teacher. Like he was basically sort of exposing a little bit of some of the sentiment in theosophy that they were trying to almost create their own thing, which was based on Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and like other Western esotericism, but they were almost like trying to create their own Shivas and their own Vishnus and their own Brahmas. You know what I mean? Like,
well, that's something definitely what Jiddu would be opposed to, isn't it? Because he's against having that agenda and this strong group thinking.
Yeah.
So definitely that having a strong agenda of building a kind of new organization or new religion or whatever the image they had, and they want him to be a world teacher of their organization.
Yeah.
So that implies to have a strong agenda. Like, I mean, you have to have an agenda to establish an organization, right? And that's definitely Jiddu's, what he was against, actually.
Yeah. He actually said in that speech exactly what you were saying. He's saying that, why would I create another boundary to truth? Because all this would be is another barrier and boundary to truth. And he said exactly what you were saying, like all of these religions, all of these philosophies and everything like that is all, in a sense, not what the truth is. The truth is a pathless land. It's something that you can't get through following a sort of a certain system of thought or a certain culture or this and that. It's something that it's experiential knowledge, right? Like it would relate to what we would say in Vedanta as jnana, or in Gnosticism as gnosis. It's that experiential knowledge that you have. It's a felt experience of the nature of reality, the nature of, the dissolution of the subject-object split. And a lot of people, in a sense, mistaken Krishnamurti a lot because they think that, his knowledge is completely divorced from a lot of Eastern spirituality, because he does, in some sense, criticize a lot of religions, and included in that is Hinduism. And so, but it's ironic, right? Because in India, he's like,
Indians love him.
Even though Jiddu somewhat was always talking about the dissolution of religion as kind of a step in the right direction for the the advancement of humanity. But in some sense, when you understand Krishnamurti's philosophy, it's like a Vedantist. He speaks like a Vedantist or a Buddhist or a Taoist, but he speaks without the terminology. You know what I mean? He's speaking in English without the use of like saying jnana or these sorts of words. But he does use terms as the self in the same context as what you would say Atman. And so, all of that, he has that about himself in his teaching style, and that was part of his philosophy. And so I think a lot of people mistaken that, he is like anti-spiritual, so to speak. But like when you understand his philosophy, it's the deepest, spirituality in a sense, because it is the essence of Vedanta, of Buddhism, of Taoism. That essence of, that the individual itself is an illusion. That, this idea of object, subject, the observed and the observed, the seer and the seen, that in itself is an illusion. And it would be like reading, like, for example, you read Total Freedom by Jiddu, and then you read the Mandukya Upanishad, and you go, well, it's pretty much the same book. There's a lot more words in Total Freedom, but it's gearing towards, the same end.
Yeah, what he was against about religion was that maybe a dogma and like rituals and social structural thing which was based on religion, and that kind of thing is he was against, not the very essence of the teaching.
Not the essence of the teaching, yeah. Because he pinpoints a lot that the images and the concepts we create in our mind are actually the barriers to the truth. So the problem, what he saw for religion, was that there's too much of the conceptual framework and too much of the images that we have in our mind not just about religion, but about ourselves and all of these things that, get in the way. It's like, as you know, in Zen Buddhism, one of the focuses of Zen is to get rid of all images from the mind. Now, that's a completely difficult task because we often have an image of ourselves, first and foremost. No matter what religion or philosophy you follow, or whatever culture or country you're from, you have an image of how you should be, or and usually that's an accumulation of the life you've lived, right? So, like Jiddu said, you know the truth the first step you take into the world, but that's as we were born. But then as we grow, we are divorced from the truth, because of this accumulative knowledge that we gather as we, grow and get conditioned, right? So Jiddu's big philosophy is on the conditioning of humanity. So once someone is conditioned, they can't see reality as it truly is, because you're seeing through your conditioning.
Yeah, definitely. Religions and belief system definitely bring individual conditioning.
Yeah.
And that creates the images in our own mind, which is artificial, really. It's not real, that we created from our own conditioning again. Yeah, so that's what he was strongly against.
And that's the individual. That's what we refer to as the individual. This is why Jiddu was very, stern on that the individual doesn't exist, because that's what the individual is all of that conditioning. So what happens when you take all of that out of the equation? When you work through that and you free yourself from your mind. When he talks in total freedom, he says, complete freedom is the freedom from the conceptual framework in our mind, the freedom from the images in our mind. It's not the freedom that we think of in the external world. It's freedom from our individuality.
Yeah, definitely. When we think of freedom, normally we think of freedom as in a way that very superficial way, meaning that freedom to do whatever we want, say whatever we want to say, and dress up with whatever you want to get dressed up, and so forth and so on. But again, that's not the real sense of freedom. And again, that's not what Jiddu was really talking about. The freedom is truly free from our own conditioning and psychological barriers in our mind. And that's why he strongly argued how important the psychological growth is.
Yes.
That implies a psychological growth to get away from our conditioning. That, we all were born, right? And we were born in a certain household, parents or siblings and whatever, and it's then from day one we get conditioned, right? And up until the day we are today, the individual is accumulation of those histories and information, right? We were told to do certain things. We were told to behave a certain way, to get praised as a good kid, this and that. That's all conditioning.
Yep.
And every little thing, even the way you dress, the way you behave, the kind of food you like, the way you think, the way you judge, the way you perceive the world and perceive other people around you, everything is based on your conditioning.
Yes.
Unless you try to clean that condition out of your mind. And that's basically core of his teaching.
And it's interesting because you said that, we often think freedom is the freedom to do what we want, right? The freedom to dress the way we want and this and that. But Jiddu would say, you're still in a sense a slave, because that sense of freedom is still conditioned. You see? So your freedom that I want to dress this way and I want to do this is my freedom of expression. But that's still influenced and conditioned by a certain reality that you live in within your head.
That you are a slave to your own ego.
Your own ego, yeah.
That persona that you want to stand out.
You want it to stand out.
You want to stand out amongst people. And I would say, why? Why do you feel that you need to stand there? That would be my question. But again, a lot of people come from that place, and like, I mean, I'm not against anything what people do, but like, they just covering their skin with tattoos, and there's nothing wrong with it, but intention behind it, I would question. Like, why do you feel that you need to do these things? And yeah, again, certain behaviors.
Well, Jiddu would question that. Would question like why they would want to wear certain clothes, why they would want to get certain tattoos. Sadhguru has done that in recent times, right? Like when someone asked him about, should or shouldn't we get tattoos, and to speak honestly, he said, like, what's the intention behind a tattoo, like, and is it something fleeting, like, and is it something that you're trying to, in a sense, prolong this sense of persona through, marking your skin or wearing different clothes, or, you're trying to prolong this sense of persona. Now, if you're into Eastern spirituality, it's about the dissolution of the persona, which is why, if Jiddu was alive today and he saw the way culture was, like, he probably would not be accepted in the modern world, because he would actually be saying things like this. He'd be saying, like, you guys are just trying to prolong this sense of self that you believe you are. But it doesn't exist.
As you and I know clearly, that we always change.
Yeah, 100%.
Physically and mentally, but maybe more so mentally.
Yeah.
The moment before and moment after, you might see the world completely different. So psychologically, we are ever in growth mode. So how can you fix yourself in an image to identify yourself as who you think you are or who you want to be?
Yes.
It's very superficial expression of what you think you are, really.
Yeah. And again, it's still coming from a place of conditioning. What you think you are is still a conditioned perspective. That's the crux of it, right? Like, I can give myself any labels I want, right? Jason, Australian, dopey head, whatever. But it can't actually define who I am. It can give me a covering and can divide me from reality, but it can't unite me with the actual real reality. It can't bring me back to what I am. And so, like, that's why Jiddu was saying the individual is a divisive entity. It's a limited entity, and believing in the individual itself is almost an act of violence, because you're dividing yourself from the whole, and and the nature of reality and the nature of your mind is the whole. But we bought into this conditioning and the socialization and everything that we've been subject to our whole life, and then we take on that and we operate from that instead of operating from what we were originally, which is very Taoist, right? Like, because when in Taoism, you talk about Taoism, they talk about the warped nature. Our warped nature is that nature, is the person you believe you are, that accumulative sense of self that you've gathered in this life that we think is who we are, but our true nature is what we were when we were born.
That's why this analogy gets used a lot, that there's ocean and we are just a wave of the ocean on the surface. But ocean is the wholeness. It's a one thing, unified consciousness.
The wave is always the ocean. That's the problem, see? People are going around thinking that the wave is separate from the ocean. Look at my wave. It's pretty good, isn't it? It's still the ocean. And see, the thing is, when you see from that holistic perspective, you see the ocean. You don't see the wave. And see, that's one of the essences of, especially of Advaita Vedanta, right? In Advaita Vedanta, like if you talk to Shankara or Gaudapada or Ramana Maharshi, they only see the self. They don't see the wave no more. Look at, there's Guyang, look at her wave going along. No, that's up, man. What you talking about? Come off it, Shiva. You know what I mean? That's Shiva. That's that level of perception, right? That's why when David Bohm was questioned in a lot of lectures, like about that holistic reality that we're talking about, and they were saying, how can we prove that and this and that? And he's like, no, that's an experiential, felt experience. It's because your mind has to see that from the whole. You can't go to the whole with an individualistic sense of analysis and intellectual analysis like a scientist would and try to understand it. You have to, as the whole, see the whole. You see? And that was one of the focuses of Advaita Vedanta, was to come back to the Atman, and in being Atman and undifferentiated consciousness, you understand Brahman. And Brahman essentially is that substratum, right? That underlying substratum of reality, that fundamental, the Tao of reality. It's not one, it's not two, you know.
That's really interesting. I think that's one of the core thing what David Bohm was keep telling people in a scientific community. That in scientific community, as we know, the scientists like to divide things and analyze things, and so put things in a certain categories and things like that. So purely somewhat coming from that divided perspective,
yes,
which he was kind of against it.
Yeah.
And
that's the problem they have in quantum theory, right? The observer and the observed, it's the same thing, right? How do you measure wholeness? Because as soon as you measure it, you fragment it. It's contradictory, right? That's the same as like they say in the Tao Te Ching, like, as soon as you say there's this and that, you create the 10,000 things. You create the manifest world. So the way to understand the Tao is to retract and to come back to your nature. That's why in the Zhuangzi text, Zhuangzi says, when there is no more this and that, you reside in the still point of the Tao, in the infinite. You reside in that infinite place. But you can't understand infinity if you're cutting it up, because infinity is not something that's measured. It's infinite. You can cut up the finite as much as you want. You just cut it up like a pizza, it doesn't matter. But if you're talking about the Tao or Brahman, or you're talking about Bohm's idea of wholeness, it doesn't work that way.
We are somewhat hypnotized to see just fragments of reality.
Yeah. We are, yeah.
And we apply to ourselves. We separate ourselves from others, and we categorize ourselves, yes, right? I'm this type of person. That's just a hypnosis.
Hypnosis. See, the correct statement would be, I'm this type of person in this moment. It's not a stationary state. As soon as you say, I'm this person, you're giving yourself a solid form, and you're saying, this is actually who I am. And that's the hypnosis, like you're saying, that we're caught in. We don't understand that, especially when we look at the wholeness of reality in the sense of Bohm, it's this enfolding and unfolding process. It's not some sort of linear straight trajectory. It looks, in a sense, as this linear trajectory, but it's this unfolding and enfolding reality. And that encases our lives as well. But we think that our life is somehow straight down the line. It's this linear path, that this is who I am. I am this solid reality, and it can never be this other way. And that's why in psychology, a psychologist will say, if you are holding on to the same person you were when you're 18, when you're 60, you've gone through extreme psychological damage, because you haven't actually taken in the whole. Your experience has been, in a sense, trying to solidify this sense of person you think you are because it feels comfortable. And as Jiddu would say, that's a divisive entity. And the irony is, in clinging to that divisive entity, you think it's security, but that's what creates insecurity.
Yeah, the problem is that limitation, that we even judge ourselves in a certain way, and we limit ourselves to be in a certain way. That stops our growth. that's why, like you said about that psychologist saying if your psychological state is same from the age at 18 to 60, then you have some severe psychological problem.
Pretty much gone.
Yeah, I mean, that's no-brainer because life moves on.
Yeah.
It's just like a dance, somewhat. You have this. I mean, there's one. Let's say there's one dancer, but the dancer goes through all these various movements of the body, but in the end, the dancer collect himself as a dancer and just disappears off the stage.
Yeah.
Life is just like that, I think. It's just just organic movement. And people somewhat don't want to have that movement.
No.
Just they are happy with one movement, maybe.
Yeah.
And that is limiting yourself from expanding yourself as life goes on. That's why I think life itself is a big art form.
It is. Well, it's like, a musician that's just playing one note. You're like, huh? Why don't you play like a whole piece of...
Explore it.
Explore a
yourself.
whole piece of music. And, the dancing analogy is actually a really good one that you mentioned because that's similar to the idea of Shiva Nataraj. So Shiva Nataraj is, the lord of the dance, is that the cosmic dance, and life is meant to be lived. But from the Shaivism perspective is that you are life. And see what's happening in modern psychology, or what's been happening for millennia in people who try to solidify their personality, they divorce from life itself. And that's what creates the great schism, see? You're not moving with life as life. You're just saying, I'm Guyang, this is what I've been raised to be, this is who I should be, so forth and so on. And then that's going to only create, psychopathy within the individual. It's not going to, and that was one of the great frictions between Confucianism and Taoism. Taoism saying, move with life as life, see where the Tao takes you. It's uncertain where the Tao will take you. But if you're thinking about it logically, you won't do anything. You'll just sit on your hands and you won't live life. You'll be living in fear. And that's why your dancing analogy was perfect, because that's what life is. Life is a dance. And when you're moving with the dance, your life has a great zest and rhythm to it, as opposed to sitting in the crowd and watching the dance.
The conversation between Jiddu and David Bohm had, and one of the conversation clip I watched, they were discussing about self-conflict. How does self-conflict arise within an individual? Jiddu was saying that we'd like to split ourselves from environment. We're almost in denial of the environment that we are in. And you're so isolated within your own thoughts. So again, that thoughts are what he said, limited. And we keep ruminating in our own thoughts over and over again. And we never get out of it if we forget what the surroundings look like. And sometimes they also do know about this environment that they're in, but they wouldn't acknowledge it, or they are in denial, so that they're not in sync with reality. That's just like what you were saying. The reality is in this way, but you think logically, so that you want it to be this way. That's already the conflict. That's where the initial conflict arises.
Yes.
That we are not we're not in one with our own environment. And we are keep fighting against this environment. That's why the conflicts, like a riddle, it just never ends. It's never gonna end. And you wouldn't know how to get out of if you're in there too long. So that's where initially the conflict arises. So the answer is to be in sync with the reality, right? To go with the movement of reality or the environment that you're in. That way we can dissolve the conflict. And it's quite simple. And you just adjust a few things in your mind, and then you can kind of change your own reality. And you can reduce your own self-conflict that will lead you to be more peaceful state of mind. Again, which is to follow the way of the Tao in Taoism, it's saying. Again, we are in constant change, and the environment also changing. The world is changing. And if you are not in sync with this change, you will fall behind, or you are in constant conflict, which is very self-destructive. And sometimes I witness that people almost don't want to get out of this conflict because their belief in their dogma is so strong. Again, the conditioning is so strong. They are in denial of this change.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, like Jiddu would always harp on about, you're denying the world, but you are the world. You are the environment, so to speak, And he's not saying it in the sense that you're like, for example, you're attracted to all this digital stuff, and like he's not talking about that as the world. He's talking about, when he talks about the world, he's talking about the fear and the anxieties, the lack of compassion, these real things, like those superficial things don't matter, like also the cultural tenets. He's talking about the human nature side, especially when he's talking about the world. So when we look at the world, it's very fearful, people are lonely, and then what he would say is look inside yourself. You're fearful, you're lonely. Now explore that. Don't try to escape it. Look at it. Observe it. What is it? Is it really part of your nature, or is it part of a sense of self that you've accumulated that's made you feel separate and isolated from the reality that you experience? We know the answer to that, right? Once you move that out of the way, we can get to that stage what you were talking about. You can then move with the world as the world is. You are then one with it. You are whole. Because you see the world whole, you are part of the whole, and you move with the whole. Because you are part of the life. You're not separate from the environment anymore.
That negative emotion that you were saying, the misery, suffering, pain, greed, despair, all these emotions, negative emotion, is actually coming from that strong conditioning.
Yes.
Meaning that we keep limiting ourselves from others.
Yes.
That strong conditioning is the core of all those negative emotions.
Yes.
And that's, you said it beautifully, that once we dissolve those emotions, then we can move forward. Then we can see things clearly, because we no longer think from that conditioned state of mind.
Jiddu would say that you can't even have good relationships when you're from that place, and you actually can't even know what love is, because your idea of love is conditioned. It's based on personal agreements, sort of in some sense, that with the other person, that they are like this, that's what my persona is like, and so forth and so on. Whereas you're not coming to the relationship and seeing that they have the same fears and the same anxieties, and they suffer from the same affliction that we all suffer from. And then only when you start to explore that in yourself that you can come to a relationship purely and love sincerely, because you've seen beyond or beneath those apparent, flaws that we have as a human. So only then he would say, like, he spoke about this on relationships in one of those books, about how once we sort of mine those negative aspects of the human nature, that then we can fully, create a harmonious world, because then our relationships are not bound by conditioning, not bound by this concept that fear is bad, or that fear doesn't exist. Fear exists, The reason why fear persists is because we're trying to always escape fear. You see? We're trying to always escape fear. We're trying to always escape our anxieties, our stress, and we're not looking at it and observing it and seeing what its nature is.
Thich Nhat Hanh once said, mind is something that you need to take care of as if it's like a just newborn child.
Yes.
I really like that analogy, because all those negative emotions arise pretty much any time, really, right? But if you can really take care of it, look after it, that means to face with it completely. And you can fully hug your own negativity, own negative emotions, then you can truly love everything.
Everything, yeah.
Even those emotions. You can embrace whatever it comes, right?
Yep.
That's practicing real love.
Because your perception of reality is not conditioned anymore. See, when you have a conditioned version of reality, it's a divided version of reality. You see? It's completely fragmented. But when you have none of that, there's only love. Because love itself arises from an unconditional state. It's a feeling we have of when the person, in a sense, subsides. That's why when we have an intimate relationship with someone else, usually that strong sense of yourself, in some sense, is a little bit diminished, because there's another person there that you feel affection for. But if you keep the old regime of thinking going on, that relationship cannot prosper and blossom.
It'll never work.
It'll never work, right? So that's why that's why we've always been attracted to intimate relationships, because that gives us that sense of love. But the love that you and I are talking about is even greater than that, because it's not even conditioned by the relationship itself. It's something that's beyond all conditionality, and it's a feeling, it's a felt experience of a connection with everything. Not even a connection with everything. You are everything. It's like what the Vedantists would say, that pure love arises when you realize you're the Atman. And there was only ever love. It's like when people take psychedelics and they are thrust into that feeling at the substratum level. And when they come back to the fragmented reality, their fragmented mind, I should say, not the fragmented reality, their fragmented mind, that's when the suffering occurs. But what the psychedelic experience reveals is that that's the work that they need to do on themselves as well. Like, they need to get out of this fragmented, conditioned sense of reality to see the world as it truly is. And so that's what we need to do on a relationship level as well.
People say that you need to love yourself first to love others. And to love ourselves is quite a mission, I think. But how could you look at yourself that you have... honestly, you gotta be, first of all, you gotta be really honest with yourself. And I'm not a good person, or I misbehaved, and I lied, and this and that, it all comes up. And it's just something that we need to do some deep psychological work. That loving yourself is a good start, but again, the pure love itself has no sense of I
No.
no longer exists, and that's
Well, that's why that phrase is a little bit bogus, right?
Yeah.
You need to love yourself. Like, that's a strange one, right? That's kind of like even New Age spirituality talk about that. What is a better phrase is you need to accept yourself. Not because the idea of loving yourself, like loving who? Loving this conditioned personality, this persona, that doesn't make any sense. But what makes sense is accepting my flaws, accepting this, because then that leads to further growth.
That's you practicing pure love. You even accepting that part of yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good start.
It's a good start, yeah. But like you said, like pure love arises when there's no sense of I. The Brahman the I in Brahman minus the I. That's when pure love arises. That's when that unconditional perspective of love arises. Even though a lot of people disagree with this idea of unconditional love, but when you talk to the mystics and you talk to the great sages, they have a different version of reality. They live in that field, that sense of that loving consciousness that's undifferentiated, because they're constantly not fragmenting their mind. They're constantly not accumulating new things to split their mind and to divide themselves from reality. They definitely don't watch the news. You know what I mean? They definitely don't watch the news, and they're not engaged in drama. It's interesting, right? So, and Jiddu talks about that too. Like, it's interesting that the positive is experienced, or pure love is experienced, is in negation, when we negate reality. It's not in like accumulating more and conditioning yourself more to love more. Like you said, you need to love yourself. Like that's even a condition you're putting on yourself, right? I'm conditioning myself to love myself. And Jiddu would be like, no, that's conceptual. You got to throw that away. You got to also throw the other stuff away. It's in this path of complete negation. And as you know, that's the path of an avadut, or a path of a Shaiva, is this complete dissolution of the I, this complete negation or this idea that you think that this I exists. You got to get out of that. That wait up, this I don't exist. This I is like what you said, a wave. It's a temporary phenomenon. So why am I clinging to a temporary phenomenon that is surely going to disappear and return back to the ocean? Why not identify with the ocean now? Because that's who I truly am and will ever be. I will never be this wave.
It's just under hypnosis it is.
Yeah.
But it's not truly.
It's not truly, yeah. It's a temporary phenomenon. And that's why in all the great traditions, that's why, Buddhism has a focus, Nietzsche has a focus on impermanence. Yeah, that's why you find it all in these spiritual traditions. You've got to get comfortable with that sense of self that you think you are. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's a conditioned perspective of reality. You've given nama rupa, you've given form to the clay, but you're always the clay. That clay, as soon as rain hits that clay, the clay just goes back to this, the same form. It's always the clay, and that's the thing for us, It's coming to that realization, and that's why Jiddu's work was especially important. And to give a little bit of background too, because you and I have a long history with Krishnamurti. When we go back to 2009, right? We go back to 2009, and you and I were living in Varanasi, Benares, or whatever you want to call it, or Kashi. But we were in Varanasi, and we spent a lot of time at Jiddu's house in Varanasi, and the school, the Krishnamurti school there. And a lot of people probably don't know that Krishnamurti actually has schools, right? So, and the kids that they produce, right? The kids that they produce at their schools is quite amazing, because they're learning about life itself. Sadhguru even sent his daughter to a Krishnamurti boarding school. And the irony with that is that Sadhguru pulled his daughter out of school at 15, 16 because she discovered that she wanted just to pursue dance. So why does she need the extra few years of education? And it's interesting, right? Because that she's the byproduct of Krishnamurti's school. So you find that, what you're saying, that rhythm or that life, and then you pursue that. You're not pursuing logic and, of course they're learning mathematics and they're learning science and they're learning these things, but the way that it's oriented is completely different, And there's a focus on nature. Like if you ever read Krishnamurti's On Education, it's quite a fascinating read, because even if you read Total Freedom too, because Total Freedom speaks about this too, when people are asking Krishnamurti about education, and he's talking to them about listening to the birds, listening to the insects, this is education. You see, and it's an education that we divorce from. That's the wholeness, right? That's the embracing it's that fullness, right? Like where you listen and it's complete, right? But when you're in your head, it's like that time when, I always mention in my books, in the Himalayas back in, 12 years ago, whenever, and I was up in my head thinking about things I was working on, and we walking like 200 kilometers into the Himalayas, and you're like, don't the cicadas sound great? And then I realized in that moment that I was not in the moment. I was not in that whole state. I was up in my head thinking about future projects and blah blah blah, all this sort of crap that you can't do anything about when you're up in the mountains. You know what I mean? There's no thing to work on up there except for just walking and eating and drinking water. And so that is a form of education. That's why Sadhguru said, some young people asked him once in university, like talking to him almost in a negative way about rural people in India, and Sadhguru, being Sadhguru, was pretty forthright when he's like, you kids are just thinking about intelligence in the sense of what you gather at in school here, but those people in the rural community have a different sense of intelligence that you will never have. They know about the land, they know about the sounds of the birds, they know how to cultivate and plant plants. They have all of this different intelligence that you don't value because you've taken on board this Western view of education, of how life should be, which is all mental and all rational, right?
Speaking of that, I remember how you were saying about life in Korea. Like this Western way of thinking gives us clear distinction between Korea and your life.
And your life, yeah.
But how?
How, yeah.
Korea is part of your life, and it's not something that you can separate it from your life, your living. And almost people focus on too much of their Korea, so they kind of forget how to live. And that's tragedy.
It is. Yeah, it's interesting you said that, because when you think about that, when you're divorcing your career and your life, so what are you doing? You're creating, this career is the life of yourself, the life of your individual persona.
So Korea is life.
For the individual.
For the individual, yes.
Do you see?
Okay.
But life itself is not individualistic. You think it's individualistic because you're living this career path or whatever it is that you're choosing to follow. I'm creating this life for myself. You're creating a life. Life is already there. There's no creating a life. Life is there and you live the life. You're making a division where there is no division. You see? And that's what people are constantly doing. So the Western education is teaching you, especially, that don't worry about life itself. That does its thing. You focus on, when they say you focus on yourself, they're saying you focus on your persona, which is separate from the whole world and limited. That's the honest observation, or that's Jiddu Krishnamurti's observation of what they're saying. So you're focusing on this divisive entity that is not connected to anything else. So you create a life for that. And it's like, but that's already connected to life. I don't understand how that actually operates. Obviously, they're not inquiring that deeply, because people don't inquire deeply in life. They live their life, right? Or they live the individual's life divorced from the actual life. That's why when people would go on long walks with Jiddu, back in, even in the earlier times when they go for long walks along the Ganga and that, and they'd be talking about things, and Jiddu would be saying like, isn't it amazing how like the sun, rose that particular way today? And they're like, all our bunch are like, this guy's lost his mind. But he's constantly bringing your mind back to that awareness of the life itself that's constantly there, that you keep separating from. You're constantly divorcing from that. And that's pure consciousness, right? It's like when someone asked Joseph Campbell, what's pure consciousness? And Joe said, did you see that the way that flower bloomed? And they're like, yeah.
There you have it.
There you have it. I mean, it's mind-boggling for some people. They're like, man, he's crazy. He's gone full bonkers. You know what I mean? Like, he's like some sort of Eastern mystic now, you know what I mean? Like, waxing lyrical. But it's an example of that pure consciousness that's constantly there, animating life. But you're missing it. You're missing it because you've bought into this little theatre show you got going on in your head, and you're attracted to this little theatre show. This is just a local cinema that you're interested in. This is a local cinema. You know what I mean? You need to get onto the box office stage. You know what I mean? Like, you're attracted to this little local cinema. And this movie is an old movie that you keep focusing on, this movie of yourself. You know?
That's why Western way of living life, I would like to put it this way, that logical, linear, intellectual, analytical, so that you ought to keep giving your input to your life.
Yes.
You gotta keep trying something, try to achieve something, force it, and create a goal, and become a go-getter, and all these things. And again, not surprisingly, the Western world credit those individuals.
Of course, yeah.
But again,
he's a go-getter.
But again, from that place, you miss those things.
No.
That's not even in your concept.
No.
Not even in your head. It doesn't even exist. Whereas in the Eastern philosophical way of living life is paying attention to things, because there is no such entity who are living life. There is already life out there for you to live on.
Live on.
Pay attention to what's happening around you and look at it. And if you like it, well, take a look. If you don't like it, you don't have to have a look. And you just keep going this journey. And along the journey, you will meet so many things. And it comes to you instead of you become a go-getter. You go out and get something. You are accepting and absorbing what's happening around you, and you pick what offers you, right?
Yep.
And that encourages you to paying attention little things, even your little emotions that arises you, or whatever incident happened around you, or new friends that you get to make. These things, you pay attention to what happens to your life. And in that way, you can live much more tranquil life.
We are pure observation, is what we are. And when we say pure observation, it's what you're talking about. It's moving through life without observing a life with a belief or a concept or an agenda. It's pure observation. That's why like we were talking about, you listen to the birds. You see your emotions. Do you see? Like, you're seeing everything as part of yourself. But it's just pure observation. It's not that you're seeing it through a veil. You're not seeing it through some sort of lens that, that should be this way and this and that. That leads to conflict, because already you are a divisive entity. You have limited yourself as an individual, which is already divided from the world. But when you're in pure observation mode, there's only the sounds of the birds, there's only the hum of the city, there's only these things that you miss when you're in the local theatre, in your mind.
And that's what actually Jiddu said about what the pure awareness means, really.
Yeah.
You just stay aware of what comes up in your mind. You just purely observe it. And when it leaves you, let it go. Don't cling to it. And yes, if you hear something around you, birds singing, or wind is blowing, pay attention to these things. Yes. And when it comes, it comes. And when it leaves you. And that's that pure awareness that he was really talking about.
Yeah. Well, they use the analogy in Zen, right? They use the analogy of the crystal blue sky and the clouds, right? Are you sitting around looking at the clouds, clinging to the clouds, or do you see the sky? Because what you see eventually is those clouds evaporate, because that's the nature of a cloud. A cloud is not permanent. Likewise, our mind, our thoughts, all of the concepts we have in our mind, just like clouds are rising in the crystal blue sky. And so, what are you aware of? You know what I mean? So the crystal blue sky is the sound of this and the sound of the birds, and you know what I mean? All of these things that we miss out on. And the clouds, and the form of the clouds, are our thoughts and the dramas we have in our life, the perception of people as separate from yourself and everything else, you know what I mean? We're focused on that reality. We're focused on this foreground. We can't see the background.
And then suffering comes from if you attach to it.
Yes.
If you attach to the cloud, and you want the cloud to be the way it looks, and you want it to be always there in a certain spot, so that you can always see if you want to see, you get attached to it, and that's where all these suffering and pain come from.
Exactly. It all comes from the individual, you see. So a lot of people, what's happening in the world, right? As I speak about in Fasting the Mind, the need for speed is suicide, right? So everyone's focused on this idea, like what you were saying, this Western idea of promoting the sense of self, having value, having purpose, bringing something to the table that inspires people.
And make yourself useful.
Make yourself useful, which is, obviously in the Zhuangzi text, he just makes complete fun of that, like, because he talks about the useless tree, and he actually
completely the other way around,
and he ridicules like leaders and philosophers and even politicians, because they have an axe to grind. They have a sense of that they ought to have value and purpose. And Zhuangzi is pointing out that no, that is what actually contributes to more suffering, because you're trying to give oxygen to a sense of individuality that doesn't really exist. So you're trying to give oxygen to this thing, and you're trying to prolong this sense of self, this ego, that it's not permanent. It's going to disappear. It's the cloud. And so that's where all suffering arises. And so what's happening in the world today is we have big increases in the amount of people of suffering from depression, anxiety, suicide rates are through the roof, worse than ever before. And the elephant in the room that no one's talking about is this Western tendency that the world has to excel over other people. So why we see bad suicide rates in East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, is because they've taken on this Western model, which is a different cognitive model to the Eastern cognitive model. So it's individualistic, which doesn't match up with Eastern cognition, which is collective. And so you're then forcing children to be a certain way, to compete with other children, to get the so-called job that is acceptable within the society. And then that child ends up jumping out of a building at a very young age. And then we are supposed to sit around and say that we live in a healthy and sane society. As Jiddu said, there's no measure of health to be profoundly adjusted to an insane society. So, like, mocking the mentality of people in the world, like How can you be so adjusted to a completely insane society? It's insane. We're creating insane people. And that's why, like, for example, Zhuangzi was, and Lao Tzu too, were creating philosophies for a healthy, insane society, first and foremost. Because they would see Confucianism in that sense. Because Confucianism, in a sense, is very similar to Western society, but it's not as individualistic, but it's similar in the sense that it creates falseness in people and hypocrisy. And so that's what's happening in the West. And see, it's ironic, right? You're told by society that happiness is at the end of this process, right? It's at the end of this process.
Promised land.
The promised land, yeah. There's BS about the promised land, and so it's at the end of that. But what do we find? You suffer. Some people don't make it. You know what I mean? Even highly successful people. You know, we watched the other day the podcast on and talking about Anthony Bourdain. You know, had all the success in the world, amazing individual, but didn't know how to understand himself. And then we know the end of the story there, you know what I mean? Like he took his life prematurely. And so, but this is not just he's just one example. There's so many examples of suicide where people have success or so-called success from the eyes of other people. Robin Williams, right? And then for them, it's nothing. It's not the happiness that was promised. The promised land is the BS land. It stinks. And this is a path you shouldn't follow. That's why Zhuangzi ridiculed all of those people who were so-called pious people and this and that, because he understood that land stinks. That's the stink of Zen. You are gonna slip into a trap that you can't get out of, because you missed the reality around you, because you focused on this. You missed this reality around you. And it's ironic because people will say, but I won't achieve anything this way. Who's achieving what? And why is achievement the be-all and end-all?
Yeah, why is this so important to you?
Why is it so important to you, yeah. Why is your self-esteem so low that you have to achieve something to prove your worth to other people? That's a sense of low self-esteem, right? You're not confident in being nobody. You're not confident in being Lin Chi, as radical as Lin Chi. What are you doing today, Lin Chi? Just moving my bowels, eating my rice, having a sleep. Productive. But the point of Lin Chi's wisdom, is that if you're not focusing on that reality, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it. You'll never find happiness. You'll never find contentment. Lao Tzu's thing, right? That do you know the contentment of contentment? Imagine talking to like people in the world now about that. They would think, he's gone crazy. What contentment of contentment?
Well, as you know the best, that I have suffered a lot from having that low self-esteem, which is purely the product of what you were saying exactly. About these Far Eastern Asian countries. Make sure you do better than the kid next to you. Make sure you go to a better university than your cousin, someone.
It's childish, isn't it?
But I was raised like that for whole life, basically, until I left.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, unfortunately, my parents weren't most kind people to their own children, always praising about whatever you do, whatever you've achieved, even a little thing, even participation award. Like, that's something just always been taken for granted.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, that's everybody gets it, right? Like, kind of thing. Of course, my parents been giving me so many opportunities and things that I could never get. But predominantly, I don't have much memories that I was praised a lot from something that I thought I did something, you know. Like, And when I did something, they would take it outside to show off for themselves, using their child.
Yeah.
And I was raised like that, you know what I mean? That's why, I'm not good at this. I'm not good enough at this. I'm not good enough at that. There's no, confidence.
No.
But more I get to know these Eastern wisdom traditions, confidence doesn't arise from, yes, I overcome this, I'm going to be a confident person. Or, I don't know, I'm going to do this from now on, so that's going to give me more confidence. Actually, the very intention and act of trying to get the confidence doesn't work, I don't think.
No.
But what works is to have your strong center of your true self, and you live from that place, and you try to see the world from that place, and the real confidence arises. Meaning that you are completely okay with where you are, and you are completely happy with who you are, where you are, and you accepting yourself as you are. You're not asking too much of yourself. You're completely okay with where you are, and that's the real confidence, I think. And that's actually the real meaning of what charisma is. A charismatic person doesn't try to be charismatic, right?
There's no need,
Yeah, there is no need. And that person would be just completely happy with where they are and act from that place, live from that place, and see the world from that place, so that world is not against you. You don't have to compete anymore with the kid next to you. It's everything is inclusive. It's you are part of it, and you are with it instead of being against it. And that's where real the ease in your mind take place. You find your place within yourself, and that's where you can really reside.
Yeah. Well, the irony is, like in Taoism, it's what you're talking about, is that when you do work through that and you do accept your persona and you begin to come back to your true nature, that's when you begin to exhibit de, virtue. And de can be translated as charismatic power, right? So it's ironic because the more you come back to that, this is kind of relates to a sage too, the more people are attracted to you, you see? But when you're operating from the individual persona a lot, it's difficult to have relationships with other people because there's conflict, you see? But then when you clear that out and you're operating from a different regime, the regime of the Tao or the regime of Brahman, then people, flock to it like bugs flock to a light. You know what I mean? Like what happened to Ramana Maharshi, like one of the more recent examples, right? Like sitting on a mountain, just chilling. Next time people started turning up, you'd be like, what the hell are these people doing hanging around? Like, you know what I mean? Like, but that's how it is, see? And it's ironic because people are trying to, like what you said, like trying to add to themselves to inspire others to be someone, this and that. And it's actually in the subtraction that process happens. And people may argue, you've what about go-getters and this and that. That's okay. That's for that. You know what I mean? We're talking about actual reality here. We're not talking about this Western version of reality that creates a lot of suffering and conflict and is individualistic. Those people that you think are on a pedestal have a lot of people working for them, keeping them relevant and so forth and so on.
Also a business relationship.
It's business minded, right? So that's what happens with individualism, right? Like this, is it becomes a business relationship. It becomes a sense of business. Everything is a business then, right? What you're selling is a commodity. You could even be doing spirituality. It becomes a commodity, right? And so there are these problems. But when you look at the other way and you're subtracting and this and that, that's what actually creates enlightened people and people of extreme intelligence and empathy and compassion and forgiveness, which is what actually has, I don't like to use the word value for those, but that's what really has value. See, our value system is wrong. We're valuing the things that don't matter. We're valuing, like you said, the career path, the individual path. We're not valuing that actual reality that's always there, but we don't see it.
Somewhat, the economy is a new religion.
Exactly.
That's what the real value is for a lot of people. Yep. So that's how we identify with what the value is. But there's not real sense of value at all.
No. Well, see, people believe in the religion of the economy over and above the environment and over and above the health and well-being of people.
Humanity.
Humanity. It's interesting, right? And when you pinpoint that, but then people have excuses. Oh, but we need the economy for this and that. Come on, we're intelligent humans. We can find another way.
We, as a human species, evolved for thousands of years, millions of years, without economy.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, economy came to place, like, let's say, just trade, you give something, I get something. This kind of sense of economy has been existing for...
I don't know how long, but anyway.
Yeah.
But not as long as what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, yeah. And then the banking system kind of appeared only just over 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's type of one,
Yeah, which is bloody, not even a speck of a human history.
Well, we're so narrow-sighted, as you know. We think that what's happening now is the be-all and end-all. Again, that comes down to a very self-centered, individualistic approach to reality, And people are thinking that about everything that they're experiencing. Like with the podcast we released the other week about the Taoist approach to coronavirus and stuff like that, and some people got hot under the collar, but some people understood it. Like, you guys are seeing it from the bigger picture, like where other people are caught in the detail. And see, usually the individualistic path is often caught in the detail, over-analyzing. Its nature is to over-analyze. It's intellectual, you see. What we're talking about, the greater reality that you sense, is intuitive. It's a felt experience. It's more related to the hot cognition. It's not in the cold cognition. We're constantly residing in here, and we're caught in the detail. Remember in my book, The Science and Practice of Reality, the differences between the warrior and the sage's state of awareness, where the warrior's state of awareness is always caught in the details of reality and can't see the bigger picture.
And the warrior would always see the problem within it,
yes.
Right? Because why? Warrior tends to see the little things and pieces it separately, and they're so just full of chaos.
Yes. But when you have the sage's state of awareness, you see, it's like being on a mountaintop and looking down at a city, where you see, when you look at the city from a distance, you see a pattern, you see a rhythm that you can't perceive when you're in the environment, you see? That's the difference. So when you're stuck in it, you're involved in it, you can't have that greater perspective, that greater awareness of what's happening,
And that kind of reminds me, one of the David Bohm's speech at the Science and Non-Duality Conference, is it?
Yeah.
In Dharamsala?
No. Mind Life Institute.
Oh, that's right, with alongside Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama, yes.
Time. As a panel and as a scientist, he was saying that how science actually should take a step further. So science always been concentrating on these little pieces of study, right? And try to prove it and analyze and whatnot. But what he was trying to say was that make the science to expand to bigger realm of seeing the reality. Meaning instead of measuring and splitting every little things, try to look at the bigger picture and trying to find the order within that bigger picture. That's what he was trying to say as a scientist. Well, a lot of his theories got mocked entire his career in the mainstream scientific community, unfortunately. But I think there is a very important point there.
Yeah.
How could science evolve without seeing the bigger picture? They're trying to keep ignoring it, right? They know it exists, but because they can't prove it, they don't want to go there, right?
No.
But that's what David Bohm was strongly fighting.
Well, that's it. Like, if you're only analyzing the details, how does that give you a greater perspective, right, of reality? And there's many reasons why David was ridiculed, but like what you were saying, he was ridiculed a lot because his theories and ideas were leaning more into mysticism and spirituality, and that's why he gained an interest in Jiddu Krishnamurti, you see. So, like, he was off into realms of philosophy and mysticism that, especially back in the mid to early 1900s, they weren't accepted. Because, you were just a doofus if you were exploring mysticism, if you were a scientist. Though I'm sure there secretly was some scientists, engaging in that. As you know, people engaged in quantum physics often entertain mystical ideas because sometimes that sort of certain philosophical inquiry can give actually deeper insights. And so what we're sort of dealing with is that the scientific inquiry, like you were saying, is constantly almost geared towards looking at details and this and that, where the philosophical inquiry is always trying to look at the greater picture. And science can actually learn a lot from philosophy if it took it serious. You know what I mean? And this comes down to biases we have towards certain functions of the mind. Like, for example, science have a strict bias for rationality in the prefrontal cortex, the ability to intellectualize and analyze things. Whereas, as you know, in mysticism and spirituality, it's more to do with the hot cognition. It's about the intuitive sense we have of reality, that felt experience. And that's, again, I've mentioned many times, why Robert Macaulay wrote the book. Why science is... no, I always get the name wrong.
Science... why religion is
natural and science is not. That's right. Yeah. I always get the name wrong. So that's why he wrote that book, right? Because of that felt domain that became religion, and the spiritual path became philosophy. But what's happened in the last few hundred years is we've gone away from that and we've gone to a factual sense of reality. And then even though you can introduce metaphors and analogies to people and people go sit back and contemplate and go, there's something in that, what you're saying. Because that's tapping into something deeper, see? It may not intellectually make sense, but it taps into something deeper that you had not explored. And again, if you're interested in Eastern spirituality, if you don't have that faculty for the contemplative and for the intuitive sense, Eastern spirituality definitely is not for you, because if you put it under a strict, rigorous intellectual analysis, sure, you may come to a conclusion that Advaita Vedanta, mindfulness, and these sorts of things, the practices themselves have value, but the philosophies can be ignored. So this is where we commit cultural appropriation, right? Where we take just the practice and we don't want to have any of the culture or the philosophy and that behind it. But you do need it to understand it, the practices even at a deeper level. But so that's kind of what I think happened to Bohm. Bohm was constantly in that intuitive realm, because he understood that, and he tried to explain at that conference, that you're trying to understand the whole reality through analysis and intellectual rigor and logic, when that domain of thought is completely irrational. It's completely beyond logic, beyond convention. So how can you understand it from a limited perspective? You're trying to understand it from a limited view of reality. How can the finite, limited view understand the infinite? It's impossible. That's why mysticism, they would constantly tell you that you have to become it. You see, you're constantly focused on analyzing it. You're trying to theorize about it. That would be like say, for example, if you learned all of the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, and you philosophically you can wax lyrical and this and that, but you never have practiced. You never have dived into the actual what matters about it. Obviously, the philosophy contributes to your understanding because it gives you a framework, a scaffolding. But if you're only just theorizing, and you're basically just a scientist, really, you're not, or just a paid philosopher, you're not a philosopher sage. So, and that's a constant problem in the modern world, right? So our Western orientation is geared towards what we've been talking about, as opposed to the Eastern approach, or the ancient Eastern approach, I should say, which is based on that felt experience, the experiential realm. Is there something beyond? Like, I feel like, there's something more to life. Things come from those sorts of questions, right? Or the what am I? They come from those sorts of questions. And then we go into a deep philosophical inquiry, which is not accepted in the modern world these days.
Yes, science, mainstream science is definitely got a problem to be in the other side, meaning in the field of mysticism. That is why they definitely had a problem with what Bohm was saying, right? Because they could never accept themselves to see from that perspective. But that's again where the problem and the limitation of mainstream science occurs.
Exactly.
If science wants to keep evolving to benefit humanity, is to explore that realm as well.
Yep.
And only then they could evolve, I think. As long as they want to stick to this classical way of doing science, which is categorizing, analyzing, intellectualizing, whatnot, then there is no scientific advancement, really, the real sense of advancement.
Yeah. Well, there was one time when David was kind of, not really grilled, but he was asked a lot of questions by another scientist, and the scientist was asking him about the concept of wholeness, the concept of the implicate order, the idea of no separation at all, right? So the idea that there's only the Tao, there's only Brahman. And the way that the scientist was asking him was in a divisive way. So asking him, as any scientist would inquire into something, so asking him about, the intellectual, the analytical aspect of, and trying to analyze. And David kept saying that you're trying to understand it from that realm. First of all, that divisive realm you're trying to analyze it through is based on other theories in science that you've accepted, and then you're trying to understand this, when all of these theories that you've accepted in science are included in this wholeness of reality. And he was trying to get that point across, and it's very difficult, especially when you're talking to a very logical person, a very rational person, trying to get that point across, that there needs to be a new vista in science of seeing the reality from a whole place. But then you have to, as David said to him, to do that, you have to accept that that's the reality. You see, that was the turning point in the conversation. You have to accept that that's reality. And I'm not sure if the other guy could accept it, because that goes against all sorts of scientific inquiry and the scientific method in general. Because you're accepting something that's completely like, that they feel as alien, right? And this is why in David Loy's book, in Non-Duality, he goes through the science of like, where we have this idea of duality, right? And we've bought into this idea of duality, but it's only kind of the indoctrinated sense of perception that we've taken on board. We're not seeing the world in its true non-dual nature. It's almost just like a flick of a switch. You know, you've got to reorient yourself to see the world in that way. People think that that's a mind trick and this and that, but that's actually the way the world really is. You seeing it in its fragmented sense of reality is actually the incorrect, is the cognitive error, because you've divorced yourself from everything else and you're seeing it from an isolated sense of self, independent of the reality. And that's not the way the world is. That's not the way reality is, especially not from the Eastern philosophical and spiritual perspective, because everything is Brahman, everything is the Tao. You know, there's only shunyata. You know, it's completely void and empty. But you're
caught in there.
Caught in that way of seeing the world, see? And that's why David said to him, you have to accept the world the way, you have to accept that wholeness is real. That's actually the true perception of reality.
And he fully understood it as a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he was up against so many people. And
And sadly, his theories and his way of seeing the world has only become popular after his death. Isn't it ironic that we often do this with people? When they're alive, we don't appreciate or respect them. Alan Watts, right? I mean, there's many, right?
Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly. When they're alive, we just like, whatever. And then the next generation pick it up and go, what were those other dummies thinking in that generation? Like, he's like given them the straight dope and they're just like, they're addicted to the other dope, you know, to the noise of entertainment and fragmenting their mind. When he's saying to them, look, this is the reality. And even if you didn't agree with it, right, to see the world that way is a lot better than having a divided perspective of the world, which contributes to conflict and chaos and wars and deaths and famine and poverty. You know, when you see the world from a holistic reality, holistic sense, you know, there's something there, right? Like that, there is no conflict, there is no war. You know, none of that would ever happen. And I know that's a very superficial thing I'm speaking about there, but if you understood it from the deeper aspect, it would have resonances on the superficial level, on the exterior of reality, because even the exterior of reality is not separate.
It's all part of it.
It's all part of it. It's an unfolding and unfolding reality. It's almost like looking at a fractal pattern, and you go into the infinite design of a fractal pattern. It's like that, except it's constantly moving in and out like this. It's like the concept of the yugas in Hinduism, where the yugas say that this universe is this constant breathing in and breathing out process of Brahma, this constant breathing in, breathing out process. And then people think, the Hindus are crazy. And then you get Carl Sagan, who picks it up and goes, hold the phone here. This idea, you know, has like a scientific almost basis. First of all, their timescales are pretty much dead on with the age of the earth and the age of the universe. And you have this constant moving in and moving out process, this rhythm to reality. But we see the reality from this 100-year perspective like this, and we think that this is it. And it's like, your life is like,
yeah, not even...
It's nothing.
Not even dust.
It's not even dust in the cosmic spectrum, you know. And so there is this unfolding and unfolding reality that especially David would talk about. And a lot of people were interested in the scientific community when he was alive, but I guess they didn't entertain it a lot because, a lot of his ideas like hidden variables and wholeness and that were thrown out the window because, not that people didn't accept it, but because it conflicted with other theories, And it was very revolutionary at that time,
Yeah, I think that was the reason why that his idea was too revolutionary, but that mainstream scientific community couldn't disprove
No.
his study, so that we'll just keep quiet on that sort of thing.
Well, that's what Oppenheimer said, right? Oppenheimer said, I can't disprove what he's saying, but we can choose to ignore him. And it's like, what sort of...
Pretty confusing.
I said, what sort of mentality is that? You know what I mean? Like, but that's kind of the mentality of most people in the world, right? Like, I know that he's there, but we can still choose to ignore him, even though there may be some truth there. But I don't want to accept that as the truth, because that conflicts with everything that I've created, my theorizing and this and that. Even though Oppenheimer used a lot of David's ideas, as you know, to contribute to a lot of
His work
and, the eventual destruction that he contributed to. So, so what, do you accept his work or do you not accept his work? You're obviously stealing his ideas and then you're implementing them, and
obviously he had a clear agenda of his own. To defend. And probably David's idea was something as a threat for him, so that he didn't want to entertain it at all, really.
No, definitely not. But he was David was a maverick. That's the best way you can explain him. He was a maverick, and usually the mavericks in society are what lead society forward. Jiddu was a maverick too, right? That's why they were both attracted to each other, because they both had not intentionally a rebellious nature, but because of their keen intelligence and because of their, let's say, their connection to the wholeness, they were very revolutionary to the status quo because they were seeing reality from that place. That's why when you sit and you listen to a dialogue between both of them, I mean, it's like no other, you know what I mean? It's like, it's really sad in this day and age because, back in that time, especially, let's say, before 1980, so before when I was born, there was not always, but there was an appreciation of deep thinkers. And what are deep thinkers like? Nothing more? Getting together with other deep thinkers and then exploring together the nature of reality. And we saw that a lot back in that time, I mean? We don't see it now. It's kind of strange, right? I guess because of pop culture and this and that, and because who knows why,
And I think these social media kind of changed our lifestyle somewhat.
It's true. Yeah.
Then, since we've been talking about limitation, social media had brought us much more isolation than ever. Because we no longer need to be at presence of other people to be in communication anymore. We could be in communication with the people who are right opposite of the globe.
Yeah.
And you can communicate just like that person is next to you, right? That brought us such convenience, and there's this speed and information and all that type of thing, but it lost us such the intimate relationship and with one another, which brings deep thinking and such creativity, which can only come from that intimate contact with one another.
100%.
So that the social media actually contribute our life in much more of an isolation. That's why it's no coincidence that since the smartphone came out, much more teen suicide rate going up.
Yeah.
And of course the adult age people as well.
Suffering with depression and so forth, so on.
Anxiety and things like that. And it kind of robbed the intimate relationship from us, really. And I don't know...
Real connection.
Yes, real connection. And I don't know if a lot of people realize this, to be honest.
No. Well, it's a good... what's good what you're saying is it's almost like a metaphor for what we've been talking about, right? So you take on this reality, the social media reality, right, which promises you more connection with other people. But what happens in doing that? You become more isolated from other people, and you have a fixation on yourself in that reality. You see? Social media is only the reality of the persona, right? I mean, that's what it's about.
Yeah. You
can't type... I mean, you can if you want, but you could type in your name as Brahman, maybe. But you're still making a thing, see, of it. It's still an individual.
You can be a version of yourself in under a certain type of name.
Exactly, yeah.
You can have 20 different accounts in a one social media platform.
Yeah.
And you can, I want to be this guy today.
Yeah, this guy.
You know?
Yeah.
And
you live out many different personas.
This allows you to be that way.
Yeah. But that's what I mean. It's a good metaphor, right? Because, look, engage in social media. You can be connected with more people and this and that. And in some sense, you are connected, but the connection is not like what we're talking about. It's not a real connection. It's not like connection. Like you said, like in the same space as the individual. Social cues are taken away. All you really see is a name on a screen, and most of the time they're strangers, right? And so people begin to behave mischievously. This is why I don't understand when strangers talk funny to each other on social media or, in negative ways, because in the end it's a stranger. You don't talk to a stranger like that in the real world.
No, you're going to get punched in the face.
You're going to get punched in the face. And so you and I are adults, so we approach social media the same way we approach reality itself. So I try not to speak to strangers in a negative manner. Even if they speak bad to me, I try to let them know that keep in mind, to be mature here, you're supposed to, keep a level of courtesy. This is still a reality, but just because you're hiding behind a screen, hiding behind your name, usually people use an avatar or something like that, doesn't give you the right to treat people poorly. And as we've seen, that contributes to a lot of bad things. Like we see a lot of suicide of famous people and this and that because other people will, troll them and speak bad about them. And then those people don't have to pay any consequences when probably they should. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's a whole other conversation. But that's a more mature approach of looking at social media. The way that we should approach social media is we should always understand that it is a tool to connect with people you've never met and this and that. But that connection, it can never
be as real
as the real life. And so we should always appreciate that. We should always understand that, And we need to understand that also the more we go down that path of just engaging more so in the social media, we become more isolated from the world than ever before, which contributes to more social anxiety, more disconnection with the world. It's ironic, Have more connection, but the consequence is you become more disconnected. It's like, it's the same in the sense of when you have these beliefs about yourself as an individual, you are limited. You are trying to identify with groups and ideas that in themselves are divided. And in identifying with these groups, you're supposed to find security. But the irony is it creates insecurity, you see, because you're dividing yourself from the whole.
Yeah, if you step outside of the group, everybody else is your enemy.
Everybody, yeah, exactly.
So where is that security that you're looking for, really?
It's not found in group mentality. So that is the irony, isn't it? That's the irony. Like, you're seeking connection, but you're creating disconnection. You're seeking security, but you're creating insecurity. So everything that you do to try and solidify this sense of self that you believe you are creates suffering, creates conflict. It separates you from the whole. This was especially Krishnamurti's message throughout his whole life, this constant repetition of this idea, trying to ingrain it into people's mind. I'm not sure how a lot of people took it on, because you and I weren't alive in that time, but there was that constant repetition, right, of understanding that there is a reality that's constantly always there, that you're dividing yourself from because you've bought into the sense of self that you think you are. And that resonated deeply with David, you know, especially because of his understanding of wholeness, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
And so that's why those two individuals met and, you know, had a you know, basically a beautiful friendship and relationship with one another, you know. And there's many good lectures online for those people who want to listen to that. One I really recommend is actually The Nature of Mind. I remember watching The Nature of Mind actually with you in Jiddu's house. And so it was very strange, because when we would go and visit the school in Jiddu's house, there was always at Jiddu's house, which has kind of become like a foundational center, there's hardly ever any people there, you know, like empty. And I remember we walked into the video room. We were using VHS back in that time, and we went into the VHS room, the video room. There was just one guy sitting there quietly, just looking like an old, like you would think of an old like philosopher contemplating. And then we watched The Nature of Mind, and it was a magical experience. You know, we were with a friend at the time, Al. Give a shout out to Al. We were with him, and then but just that moment really sunk deeply with me, because if you watch The Nature of Mind, it's a beautiful discussion of Jiddu with a bunch of scientists. David's one, Rupert Sheldrake's another. You know, Rupert was influenced by Jiddu's ideas. And so, you know, there's so much to learn from, especially those two individuals, you know, that people can learn from. And that sense of that he's saying one reality is also divisive. The wholeness of reality, or the Tao, or the Brahman, you know, we'll give it a name, but you don't need to give it a name. But we have to come back to that reality and see reality from that state, you know.
Yeah, I think to be able to get there, we need to shed a lot of layers of skin. We are all under our own belief system, which is actually what we are used to, really. Not that we voluntarily chose it. It was just always there. And it constantly kind of feeds you so that you think that's the way it is. And again, you become conditioned by it, and you become part of it, and you consume it, and you become that conditioning, right? And you develop this faculty of being proud of that conditioning, conditioned self, which become problematic.
Well, pride is a divisive emotion. Being proud, you are dividing yourself from humanity. If you're proud of something,
that's so violent in a way.
Well, that's what Jiddu was talking about, right? Any sort of division is an act of violence, no matter what it is.
Whether that's invisible or visible.
Exactly.
That is a very source of violence.
Yes.
So we need to shed these layers of our skin to be able to see the reality clearly, to see things from the undivided place. But again, I don't think that's very difficult. Like you said it before about the scientist. It's just a kind of the flip of a coin type of thing. If you choose to see it that way, you can see it. The reason why you don't see it because you don't choose to see it that way. So why you don't want to choose to see it that way, that's a different subject.
Yeah.
Might be
You're holding on.
You are holding on to something. Your belief system is that strong, and then you need to keep questioning these things within yourself. And you should be able to choose to see the other way. Then you will get the complete picture.
Yeah. Isn't it funny that if you're holding on, what's Eastern spirituality about?
Yeah.
Release.
Yeah, release the grip.
Letting go. That's what it's always about.
That's why all these argument and conflict from one another, I see that, again, the core of all this problem and cause of it all is that grip that we just can't let go. You don't know why. And that once you start questioning why, you start to exploring your conditioned self. And that's what, again, the Jiddu kept encouraging people to do, as in, he called it like self-study, right? Like, why do I act this way? Why do I think this way? If you were to regret about something that you are doing now or past, what am I thinking of? Why do I regret about something? Usually coming from past memory, right? And so explore these things and get to the bottom of it, to just completely eradicate it, just get rid of it altogether, so that you'll be able to see the reality as it is.
Yeah.
That the pure awareness, the place of pure awareness that he encouraged people to be at all times.
Well, the reason for that is because of the belief in the identity, right? They're not letting go, and the hypnosis of that you are that person. And it's interesting because if you go to an ordinary person and you explain this to them, they would actually be very probably angry about it, because they have a strict belief in who they think they are, and
they feel offensive.
They feel you're offended. They're offended by what you're saying.
Yeah.
But you are just giving them a straight dope. And if you can't understand it, maybe there's an intelligence problem, or just not a willingness to accept it. For example, as you know, like when I was a lot younger, my journey became, top-down sort of thing. Like I never had a smooth progression into Eastern spirituality where, straight off the bat, I'm reading Total Freedom and Avadutta Gita, and it's just like... just like explosions from the start. But everything made sense. Like when I'm reading Total Freedom and Jiddu saying in Total Freedom that you're not your religion, your race, your gender, your nation, and all of these other things. You're not any of that. That was just like something I sort of always felt, but didn't have anyone else to confirm that, because I thought I was the nutter. Because I always felt a little bit, like I used to cringe at when people used to have a group association. I used to be like, that doesn't feel right. Like, what is that? Like, you're so proud to be associated with a group. I mean, but then when I read Total Freedom, and it just exploded, and I was like, 100%. This is true, actually. And there was, at that stage in my life, there was a lot in Total Freedom that I didn't understand, because, again, starting from the top down, and reading the Avadutta Gita with that doesn't help. Well, it helps, but you know what I mean. Like you're starting from the top down. You're starting with some of the most difficult books at the beginning, but maybe that contributed to what I'm doing now, maybe. But I mean, just that simple philosophy that you're not these group associations. You're not any of that. You've identified with that because you feel that that's who you are, and you've chosen a path of security, which actually makes you insecure, and it's a divisive mentality, because you're trying to secure yourself. You're trying to secure your mind. See, and this is what they talk about in Buddhism. We're constantly in this process of trying to fix our mind, to secure it. You know why? Because the nature of the mind is empty, spontaneous, and free. That's the nature of the mind. And so what do we do when we get conditioned? We try to fix that because its nature is empty, spontaneous, and free. It's completely like the crystal blue sky.
That's what I always was thinking, that everybody suffers from very similar reasons nowadays, right? And feel a lot of isolation, loneliness, anxiety, suffering from panic attack or whatnot. Whatever is causing it, I always was thinking that something is against human nature that's causing this problem. And what you said is the answer, actually, that our consciousness like to just moseying around and just wander around, and there's a free spirit. Just like the wind blows here and there, just like that. But once mind get attracted to something, stick to it. Give it all in, 100%. Full grip. And that becomes your conditioning. And that conditioning consumes you. And you become that. So what is the end result? You suffer.
Look at everyone's daily life, right? When people say when they go to their jobs or they have family commitments or they have other things, at the end of the day, people are exhausted. Why are you exhausted? Is it from the physical effort, or is it from the effort in being a self the whole day? Because what do you do when you have your time to relax? You try to forget yourself. You see, you're trying to forget who you are. You're like,
it's kind of shutting down.
This is why people are attracted to entertainment, because they can just shut down and they don't have this sense of self, So it's, again, even from a cognitive science perspective, when you're constantly here, it's physiologically exhausting, not just psychologically. It's physiologically, it taxes the body.
I think we all have that experience.
We've all had that experience.
With friends or family or.
Just the nature of being a individual is exhausting. And what happens is when people get older, and why sometimes some older people get so bitter and jaded, is because they've been holding on to that sense of self for their whole life and they haven't let go of it.
And they themselves are exhausted from playing that role.
They're just exhausted. Yeah.
But they still wouldn't know how to get out of it, right?
Well, we all know the angry grandpa, right? So the angry grumpy grandpa is just exhausted from having been or having thought they were this individual their entire life. When, like what you were alluding to, that sense that Zhuangzi was talking about, that free and easy wandering, that ease that someone has in themselves, is when they let go of that sense of self. And we've all encountered this, right? When you get into a conversation with someone and they lack a sense of ease in the conversation. Do you know what I mean? Like when you're speaking to them and they have so many opinions and beliefs that it makes the conversation not flow.
So exhausting just listening.
It's exhausting listening. And that's what Zhuangzi is pointing out. He's saying that is that firm belief and that human flaw of Qing, where we're dissecting between this and that, they are completely consumed with that. But your path on the spiritual path is to be free and easy. And that happens when you loosen the grip on the self. And the nature of the mind is empty, spontaneous, and free. It's just free to experience. It's a mind of no deliberation. It's not stuck to anything. It is the crystal blue, clear sky.
Act spontaneously without any agenda.
Without any agenda. You're acting as life itself. You're a limb of Shiva.
Again, that's why, in the Zen practice with Koan, that very act of spontaneity is appropriate.
Yeah. Exactly. When you've come back to that true place. And Jiddu and David are talking about, or are pointing to that Zhuangzi reality, that free and easy wandering, that can only happen when you see the world in its totality, when you see the world holistically, but not just seeing it as in a sense of subject-object. You are it. The subject-object reality has dissolved. There is no seer and seen. It's dissolved. That's why Jiddu said the thinker and thoughts, the experiencer and experienced, this division is an illusion. He's not saying that it's not. He says that it's good to notice that in your first observation, that there is this separation, some so-called separation between thinker and thoughts and observer and observed. But that in itself is an illusion as well. Because there's no division at all. That collapses in on itself. But it collapses in on itself when you see the world in its totality, or when your consciousness is oriented towards that.
I guess once you dissolve your psychological sense of I, that observer as in a psychological analysis, that once that dissolves, then it completely becomes one.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why Jiddu says that complete negation of thought.
Yes.
Because thought, he emphasizes, thought is time. Knowledge is time. Because thought is the product of time. It's a product of past. Knowledge is a product of past. So what is left in the present? You see? And it's not thoughts, it's not knowledge, it's not time. It's not an individual. It's all that's left is just that whole reality. And you experience it in that moment. You don't experience it through thinking about it. So you see, like the thoughts subside on their own when, like he said, like this complete transformation of mind takes place. When the mind transforms from the individual into the non-dual consciousness, or that one consciousness. And then you see the world as it truly is. And that's what both of those individuals, that was their quest, right? Both of them in different fields, one in philosophy, one in... Jiddu's not really a field, right? But they would categorize it in philosophy and David in science, right?
And I think that's the total freedom, is what Jiddu was saying.
Yeah. The freedom from...
all of that.
The freedom from self. Total freedom comes from the freedom of concepts, of time, of knowledge, of images. Because that's all a product of time. It's all a product of an accumulative sense of self that you have accumulated through your life. Yeah. That you believe is who you are. You can't find freedom through that. You can only find freedom from that.
Yeah.
From almost like going beyond that or transcending that or seeing that for what it is. And once you understand thoughts and that are a product of time and they subside, then there is only pure observation.
Yes. You're no longer attached to those thoughts anymore.
No.
It doesn't consume you anymore.
No. Thoughts will arise, but they don't, like you said, they don't consume you. They are just like observing a cloud in the sky.
Yeah.
You see
Comes and goes.
You see it. You just see it. And it's in the same way, you begin to see your thoughts in the same way as you hear the birds and the insects when you walk in nature. It's a phenomenon. No, it was another thing. But you're not going and then following it and then you're gone.
Try to get the bottom of it.
Yeah, the bottom. Then you're finished.
Yeah.
You know? So that's total freedom, isn't it? And I think, again, David's attraction to Jiddu was about that, and David's exploration into science, and, you know, Jiddu's whole life was a quest of freeing man completely, as he said in his Truth is a Pathless Land, his famous speech. My quest in this life is to free man completely. And when we say man here, we mean both men and women. And what can we say? He contributed massively to the world, and so
definitely. I mean, as you described before, your experience when you first encountered total freedom, I had a similar feeling because I had so many questions in my head, much more than now. I still do have a lot of questions, but back in those times, it more like a very, I would say, beginning level of questions, like why do I think like this? Why do I behave certain ways? What is all this? You know, because you see a lot of flaws within yourself psychologically, and how can I overcome this? Where these all come from? You know, and he showed us so many answers to those questions.
Yep.
And I was such a relief that, like a confirmation, like you said, that someone like him existed. Oh, thank God! Like that's my language talking about that sort of thing. So it was such a breeze in the head. Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people have found, right? So through Jiddu Krishnamurti, is that confirmation that you're not crazy, that the status quo are the ones who actually see incorrectly. They are consumed by a cognitive error. And like what some philosophers have said, like even speaking about Bohm's philosophy, they said there's billions of people walking around that don't even know about wholeness. They don't even know about the holistic reality.
No idea.
And this one philosopher was kind of speaking about it in almost a frightened manner because of what can happen from that place, from the individual perspective, from that place of conflict and that divisive entity. So, but those two were way out of that hypnosis. So
definitely.
Yeah. So it was a really good podcast. I hope everyone got a lot out of it, and make sure you go and check out both of their work. Like I mentioned, check out The Nature of Mind with Jiddu, and David is one of the other scientists that he speaks to. Really great discussion. Highly recommend that. Make sure you read Total Freedom, and also David's book. What's the one with the Wholeness in the Implicate Order? Read that book as well, Wholeness in the Implicate Order. And maybe even check out, there's a new documentary actually called Infinite Potential about David's life. So hope you guys enjoyed the podcast, and we'll see you guys next week.